I'm Theresa Badurek, and I am the Urban Horticulture Agent through the Extension Office. And real quick, for those of you who may not know, the Extension Office is a partnership between the University of Florida and our county. And there are one of these in every county in Florida, all 67 counties, with varying levels of service based on the county size. So we have a full complement of agents here. We cover everything from 4-H to natural resources to Sea Grant even, so we coastal resources. So I also want to emphasize that if you guys have questions that pertain to anything from nutrition to growing things to coastal issues, to reach out to the local extension office, because we're here and we're all part of the county team. But today in particular, we're going to talk about vegetable gardens, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me pull this up. All right. And I also want to let everybody know that at any time that you have a question, just feel free to drop it in the chat box. Jane's going to help me kind of keep an eyeball out for that to make sure I don't miss it. I'd love to be able to answer questions as I go so that we don't, you know, I don't want to just plow through this and pile a bunch of information. I'd rather it be a little more conversational. So don't be shy with your questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about gardening here in Florida, and this is a basic overview. This is like the 30,000, foot view of gardening here in Florida, because we only have an hour over your lunch break, but I'm glad we're able to share that. And let me make sure that this is working. It is wonderful. So a couple of reasons why I'm here. The wellness aspect of vegetable gardening is pretty obvious, right? You're going to be able to grow some of your own food. The fresher your food is, the more nutrition it actually contains. But it's also really good exercise to get out into the garden and move around, get fresh air and sunshine. And I think all of us know how important that is, especially after the last year and a half or however long it has been. So that's why we're here talking about this today in particular. It is not the best time in the world to grow vegetables right now. So as you guys well know, it's very hot out there. There are a lot of insect pests. And at the moment, it's very dry and droughty. We haven't seen a lot of rain, but any day now, as you have been here in Florida, most of you have seen, summer brings torrential heavy rains, which can be just as bad for a vegetable garden. So there are some summer crops we won't go into in detail, but for the most part, we really look at vegetable gardening starting in the fall and going throughout winter and into the spring. Those are the best times here in Florida, which is kind of nice because it's so hot in the summer. It gives you a break from vegetable gardening, and you can spend that time planning, which is why we're having this class right now, because if you don't already have a vegetable garden, now is a wonderful time to plan that out and be ready for the fall. So, as we'll talk about, some of our challenges here are our infertile soils, or as Jane called it, sand, because that's what most of us have in our yards is sand. Lots of pests and weather issues, like I was talking about. We're going to talk about how to do our best to overcome as much of those to have some success out there. We'll talk about where to put the garden, how to prep the soil, what should I grow, what time of the year, and then how to plant your seeds, plants, and also a little bit on how to care for them. So where do I plant my vegetable garden? So obviously near your house is important, but I mean that seriously, as in within view. So most of us here in Pinellas have smaller yards or even just a balcony. Probably not an issue, but if you do have a yard where maybe the spot where you have the most sun isn't all that visible, you're going to have to be really careful that it doesn't become out of sight, out of mind. So be thoughtful about the fact that this needs to be visible, because you're going to want to check on this ideally every day, but certainly several times a week, at a minimum. You can't just walk away and come back 2 weeks later and not expect to see crazy things happening. You want your vegetable garden to be on good soil. Most of us don't have that. So in many cases, we need to make good soil. We'll talk about all these things. Really important is that we're near water or irrigation. You're not going to have a vegetable garden without regular water nearby. Sources of water that are ideal for a vegetable garden: potable water that you drink is clearly ideal, and you'll never have any issues with that in terms of food safety or your own health. So that would be number one. If you have well water, this could be used, although some folks' well water here in Pinellas has unfortunately become, I don't want to say contaminated, but we have saltwater intrusion from the salt water in our groundwater. And so if your well has become salty, it would not be a good source of water for the vegetable garden. And then I saw somebody mention in the chat box, rain barrels. Rain barrels are excellent for watering. That comes with a caveat though. So rain barrels collect water from the roof, right? And hold that water for a time. And there can be issues with materials from your roof, chemicals from your roof being absorbed into the water, and not a lot of info on the safety of that being applied to vegetable gardens. So in recent years, the recommendations have really pulled back and said rain barrels should really be applied to ornamental plants. So save those for the plants all around the vegetable garden, but not for the vegetable garden. Oh yes, and I see a question out there, I love it. What about pets and how to keep them out of that space? And actually, that's the perfect time to ask about that, because we are going to talk on that in this last spot. So I'll skip to that. A fence issue. If you have pets in your yard, I have a big dog. So when I have a vegetable garden going, I have to fence it off from him. He won't jump over it, but you need to know your pet, right? So if your pet, someone's going to dig under or jump over it, that's a concern. Our particular dog will actually go behind me when I plant new plants and dig them up, because he smells the fresh dirt and he thinks that's a fun game. So you definitely, if you have pets, depending on your pet's behavior, you're going to want to think about isolating or fencing off that area. If you are somebody who lives in an area where we have deer, and there are those of us who have deer in Pinellas County, especially in the East Lake area, you definitely want to be thinking about a tall fence. And they can jump really big tall fences, or even I've seen some caged in gardens. The other alternative is to share. And I'm getting some questions, some follow-up questions from a few people about stray cats and feral cats that aren't even their cats. This can be a little bit more tricky, especially if they're not your cats. Our recommendation is that cats are always kept indoors for their own health, but that doesn't help when they're not your cats. And there's no real good way to keep cats out of the vegetable garden. The only couple of ways I've heard that tend to work are to use, this is gonna sound gross, y'all, gardening is really interesting sometimes, but using predator urine, you can actually purchase like coyote urine from garden centers and put that in a perimeter around the garden. The cats think that there's a predator around, and then they don't like to hang out there. In a slightly less disgusting application of the same idea, sometimes dog hair can work the same way. So if you have a dog, you can collect the hair that as you brush it and sort of put a barrier around your garden. And that can be helpful, but it's not 100%. And that is an issue. Yep, and someone said Amazon has coyote urine. And Jane, of course they do, you're absolutely right. You can get anything on Amazon. I love the chat box, this is great. The other question that was built in here that is applicable to this slide was a question about reclaimed water. Reclaimed water is not safe to use on your vegetable garden. There are a few caveats. So reclaimed water can contain nutrients, and it can also sometimes contain salts. Some of our vegetables are not going to tolerate the salts in it alone, and so you'll have less success. But I would say more important to that is the health safety issue. Reclaimed water is very much cleaned and filtered to a certain extent, but it's not potable water. So it's not something you can ingest. And if you were to put that on vegetables or produce that you're going to eat fresh, the opportunity for you to get sick is there, for you to have bacteria or other nutrients that you shouldn't be ingesting is there. There are a lot of recommendations for if you're going to peel, cook, and process the produce, that you could use reclaimed water. But unless you're only growing your tomatoes to peel and can them, this is probably not really applicable. So I just say stay away from reclaimed water. If you set up an irrigation system of low volume irrigation, drip irrigation in a small garden area, you should not use a lot of potable water. It should still be very efficient, and then it's safe. Yeah, and then I see somebody commented here that one of their neighbors feeds the squirrels, and squirrels will steal your vegetables too. They steal them right out of our community gardens. They'll just run up and grab a carrot and run home with it. There's really not a whole lot that you can do. If you had a small enough garden, you can build a hardware cloth cage around it. And hardware cloth is that it's like chicken wire, but much smaller, about 1 centimeter wide squares of wire that you can build over like a smaller raised bed and place it on top, and then squirrels and rats and birds won't be able to get in. But a larger garden, there isn't much you can do other than trying to deter and to share. I wish I had a better answer for that, truly. All right, so feel free to keep going in the chat. I'm going to carry on. So make sure you have water, make sure it's close. You know, again, you don't want it to be inconvenient that you're trucking water back and forth in jugs. It's going to need regular water every day at first, and then multiple times, you know, a week afterwards. So keep that in mind, that you're going to need handy water. You're also going to have to think about fences if you have pets or if there are children playing nearby, because a stray soccer ball can actually wreak a lot of havoc in a garden. So keep that in mind too. And you want to avoid tree roots. So if you're going for the full sun, which is what we need full sun, like at least 6 hours a day for a vegetable garden, then you need to avoid trees, right? Because they cast shade. But you also want to avoid their roots, because their roots will steal the water and nutrients that you're going to put in your garden. So if you put your vegetable garden among the roots of a big old oak tree and you're watering and watering and watering, that tree is going to be real happy and it's going to suck up more water than your vegetables ever could. And obviously avoid any kind of septic drain field scenario too, because of the potential for contaminating root crops. Not too many people have those, but some people still do. All right, so I need to find my controls again here. Whoops, I skipped ahead, sorry. Okay, so you picked a spot. Hopefully you have a spot with enough sun and close to the water. Now what? There's kind of two schools of thought here. There's the I'm going to garden in the ground school of thought, or the I'm going to garden in a raised bed or in containers. I'm going to tell everybody right off the bat here that your greater chance of success is going to be in a raised bed or in containers. Number one reason is because mostly we have sand and not real soil. Number two, a lot of that sand is infested with something called nematodes. This is a microscopic little worm. You'll never see it, but it wreaks havoc on your plants. It actually will infest the roots and damage them and reduce your crop. And you don't want that. So your better chance of success is in a raised bed if possible. Either way, you're going to want to look at this about at least a month before you think about planting. That's why now is a great time to talk about this. You'll see later that August is a really hot time for planting, and it's already midway through June, if you can believe that. So we're looking at a month out now being mid-July, and already in mid-July, we can start some of our seeds. So now is a great time. So this is stuff you could be doing right away to get planning and get ready for a fall garden. If you're going to plant in the ground or even in a raised bed, once you've identified that spot, it may currently be full of grass and or weeds. It's okay, we don't need to be shy about that. But you're going to want to clear that ground. And if you're going to go in the ground like you see on the top picture here, where they're just going right into the soil, then you're going to want to till or spade that soil at least 12 inches down. That's a lot of work. If you're talking about a really large garden, you might even think about renting a tiller at a big box store for the day. And if it's a smaller area, this is something that you and a friend or a spouse or a family member could probably do in a couple hours with some shovels and some hose. Next, you're going to want to add amendments. We're going to talk about those in the next slide. That's the good stuff that turns your sand into something a little bit more interesting to grow in. And you add those at the time as you till those in, so they're basically mixed in to that 12-inch soil depth. And after you do that, I'm going to have you collect the soil for a pH test. Now, pH is the most important thing, and I'm going to pull right now, assuming that I can pull this, the link to the soil test for those of you who want to do that. We're going to go back to, I'm not sure if it stopped. I think it stopped screen sharing. So let's go back. There seems to be a brief delay. All right. So if you want to go and have your soil tested for pH and other nutrients, but the most important thing here is pH. I just dropped that in the chat box. It's a PDF of the soil test sheet. Then you actually just take that soil sample yourself, and there's instructions on the sheet, and you send that off to the address there, which is at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and they'll get back to you in 7 to 10 days and let you know what your soil pH is. And you're looking for a pH, ideally for vegetables in the upper range of like the upper fives, like 5.7 to about 6.7, 6.8 is a really good range for that. So slightly acidic soil. Unfortunately, the other reason why we have more success in raised beds is here in Pinellas, most of our pHs are more like 7.5. We have very alkaline soil. So this is really important. And the reason we do that right away is because it's going to take them a week or so to get back to you. And then they're going to tell you your pH. And if you applied enough compost and other good amendments, you might have made a good pH. But if not, they're going to tell you how to fix it. And so you'll have a little bit of time to fix that before it's planting time, which is critical to take that time. And then the same thing will go for if you're going to plant in a raised bed. What's really important with raised beds is the depth. Whether you're building it yourself or you're buying a kit, you're looking for something that's at least 12 inches deep. A lot of the raised bed kits are not. If it's only 6 or 8 inches deep, you're only going to be able to grow very, very small crops. Otherwise, large things like tomatoes and peppers and broccoli, they need at least a foot worth of root space. So keep that in mind and go for at least 12 inches deep. I suspect the one in the picture here is probably only about 8. So that one probably is not the ideal depth. Although I don't have a scale for reference, I think it looks a little short, don't you? And I think there is a question. Would covering the garden spot with plastic during the summer kill the bugs? That is a great question, Laura. And that's next level gardening stuff right there, to solarize your garden for the summer. We don't have a lot of time to go into it, but you can follow up with me later. If someone's going to do that, they would need to clear it till it was bare soil like you see in the bottom picture here, water it, and then cover it with clear plastic only. If you do that, you cover it with clear plastic for about 6 to 8 weeks in the hottest part of the summer, you will kill off a lot of weed seeds, diseases, and even those nematodes I talked about. So that is a technique that you can use. What do we have here? Another good question is, should we put down a weed mat when constructing a raised bed? At the bottom of that raised bed, if you would like to separate the native soil from the garden soil, this is important. This is where it becomes even more important that you have at least those 12 inches depth. We can put down weed barriers of various kinds. Just be careful that if it's watertight, that you have drainage, because you don't want to create a big old swamp. And something that a lot of people like to use, because as someone mentioned, you can get everything on Amazon, is layer a couple layers of cardboard at the bottom of that. And that will keep the weeds down for quite some time. And eventually will break down, but it'll keep the weeds down for a while. But honestly, you're going to have success. You'll be in your garden regularly, and you will be hand pulling weeds, regularly. So that shouldn't be too much of an issue, but that would help too. All right, let's go to the next slide. I mentioned soil amendments. That's how we make our sand be fertile and something better to grow in. And there's lots of stuff that we can use, and you might already have some of it, and you might buy some of it. It depends on your budget and your time. You can use compost, whether you make it or buy it. You can use rotted leaves. So if you have a lot of leaf litter on your property, you can even use grass clippings. And I mentioned untreated here because if you have a lawn service that is treating your lawn with any kind of herbicides or insecticides, oftentimes people don't know what's being applied. And I would just say, do not use that then. If you're managing your own lawn and you know nothing has been applied to the grass that might be harmful for the vegetable garden, then by all means, that's a great soil amendment to add. You can also add horse or cow manure. It is ideal if that has already been composted first, because fresh manure actually will be so rich in nitrogen that you can burn your plants. And if your crop grows too quickly, you might run the risk of contaminating with some icky bacteria. So definitely make sure that wherever you get that from, it has already been aged or composted. The example most of you have probably seen in the store is black cow. It's already composted cow manure. So that's something you could purchase and add. But we do have a lot of horse farms in Pinellas County. So if you know of a horse farm and you can find out if their manure has been aged or composted for a while, then that would be a good addition as well. Fine mulches too. I call that, sometimes they're called pine fines. It's not the mulch that you get like the free mulch in the parks and stuff. That's too thick, it's too big, and it takes too long to break down. But I know, for example, the city of St. Pete will deliver to their residents a finer mulch, or they call it pine fines in some cases. And we can add all of these things to our sand to improve the soil nutrients and moisture water holding capacity. And then when you're ready, you can also just add a complete fertilizer. And we'll talk about fertilizer in a little bit later, like which kind is best to add. A couple of guidelines. Question down here. Yes, again, Amanda put a comment down about making sure not to add anything with weeds to your compost pile. That's definitely next level stuff, but you don't want to add any weed seeds or diseases if you're making your own compost. You don't want to put anything in there that will either grow in your garden that you don't want, or that will carry on a disease or a fungus that you might have had. But that's definitely, that would be for our compost class at a later date to dig deeper into that. All right, so our raised beds, just a couple guidelines. Basically, we make them no more than 4 feet wide. And the only reason we do that is so that you can reach everything. That's about how far in most adult arms can reach. They can be any length that you want, but most are between 5 and 8 feet long. Of course, that 12-inch depth is really important. If you have somebody who is looking to garden from a wheelchair, 24 inches high is a recommended height, and just something to keep in mind. And also, the higher the bed, the less bending. So you don't have to be in a wheelchair to appreciate that you don't have to bend down. But just keep in mind that if you make your bed 24 inches deep, that you're going to have to fill that with something. Some people just put cheap filler or old recycled materials and then soil on top. Some people even build the whole box raised up. So you can get creative with it. And there's certainly lots of plans available on, on the internet for design plans if you're into building your own stuff. The materials can vary. You can use almost anything you could think of: concrete blocks, wood. I've seen hay bales to build the outer walls with reinforcement. You can be pretty creative with it. And you can use the new or the current treated lumber that we have right now. So using treated wood, it's treated with a copper chemical that is safe for the garden. And so you don't need to worry about that. If you have very, very old treated wood and you're not sure how old it is, I would avoid using that because they used to contain some dangerous chemicals you wouldn't want to grow in. But if you went to the store now, boy, and lumber is so expensive, I don't know if you could afford it these days, but if you went there now, it would be safe to use treated lumber. You can also use just about any container that you can find if you want to grow them in smaller containers. The picture on the left is a picture of I'm sure you guys have heard the Earth Box name, and now there's like a million varieties of that. It's basically a self-watering container, and at the bottom is a little reservoir of water that wicks up into the soil. This is really good for those of you who might forget to water a little bit more, and you just have to make sure that reservoir stays filled. So that can be very helpful, but the only things we have to look for in containers is 2 things: that they have enough space for the roots. So a big crop, again, like tomatoes, peppers, you're going to need at least a foot by a foot worth of soil and root space. So that's a pretty big container. And that it has really good drainage. So it has to have drain holes in the bottom. If it doesn't, you're going to end up with a swamp and everything will die. So we don't want that at all. Keep in mind that all the watering recommendations that we make at the end, the smaller the container, the more water you're going to need to add. And so little containers like this dry out really quickly. So some of these smaller containers may require, unless there's rain, may require watering once or even more a day forever. as the crop is growing. Checking the chat box here. I love that. You don't want to sleep with wet feet, and neither do your plants. I love that, Amanda. I try to remember that saying. Okay. And then John asked that he's going to be restarting a garden that already had decent soil amendments, and what's the best way to add amendments when getting ready for the new season. So the best thing to do is the soil amendments that I showed before. It's better than potting mix. Potting mix is a little bit different. You would want to add that right at the time of planting. You could even add it now if you wanted to, and then test it, depending on if you really want to kind of test to see how that soil composition is. But otherwise, you can add it and till it in. If your garden is empty, till it into the soil just before planting. And that kind of leads me to the next comment here. For containers and raised beds, you can actually purchase a pre-made, like what we call a soilless mix that is the perfect growing media for containers. And what we look for in that is well-drained soil, nothing that becomes mucky and heavy. And so potting soil tends to hold a lot of moisture. It's great for starting seeds because they need to keep moist all the time. But if you grow always in potting soil, it's likely to become too mucky and thick, and then it'll actually become compacted and it won't drain, and your roots won't be able to get air and water. So you can purchase a pre-made container mix for vegetable gardens. Lots of different companies make them at the garden center if that's in your budget. You can also make your own by mixing one of the popular mixes that a lot of people use, and a lot of my master gardeners swear by mixing themselves, is a soilless mix that is in equal parts compost, coarse vermiculite, and peat moss or coconut coir. And I say that because the traditional blend was peat moss, but peat moss is not terribly renewable because it takes very, very long time, thousands of years to create more peat moss. So it's more sustainable to use coconut coir, and they work the same way. So a lot of the master gardeners would get together and buy large quantities of this and throw it all in a tarp and mix it all up, and then they have the perfect blend for their raised beds or their containers. If you use the soil from your yard, the sand from your yard, you're likely to end up with nematodes, and that's going to be a problem going forth. Not only that, but you might have a really high pH. And that leads me, somebody else gave me another question. What are nematodes? And I'll repeat this again. Nematodes are little microscopic roundworms that we will never see, but they live in the soil. They love sandy and fertile soils, so they're very common here in Florida. And they actually infest the ones that we worry about, because there's a whole world of nematodes, but the ones we worry about infest the roots of your plants, and they will actually cause wilting, dieback, they'll stunt your crops, and eventually they will reduce your produce. If you ever had trouble with your crops, and this is for those of you who gardened before here in Florida, if you've ever had poor looking plants and you've pulled them out of the ground and you notice the roots were all nubby and stubby with little, galls and blobs all over the roots, you probably had nematodes. That's what that looks like. So I hope that answers your question. So if you use soil from the landscape, you're likely to have nematode problems. And so even when you make these blends, it's best not to add the native soil. If you're gardening right in the ground, you're just going to have to deal with it. And there are some tricks to work around it, but we can talk about that later. All right. Yeah, it could be. Some folks are saying, yeah, that might be why their green beans didn't grow. It's very possible. So garden design, let me check my time. We're doing good here. Garden design, you want to start with taking a look at this handout that you see a little snapshot here. It was called the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. And I want to grab this again. I suppose it won't let me grab my links without stopping my share. That's okay. And I'll throw this back in the chat box. Oops. You guys are so patient. I appreciate it. Okay. And this is a fantastic guide. Goodness gracious. I lost my chat box. Hang on one second. There it is. Okay. And here is the link to the Florida Vegetable Garden Guide. And this is a fantastic tool to use because it talks about timing. It talks about what crops to grow when, what crops are best for Florida, how long from seed to harvest, everything that you're going to need to know. So I always say start off by looking this over. It's a pretty quick read. A lot of it is charts and tables at the end. So at least skim through that to get a handle on timing and some general ideas. Then I always say draw out a plan. Even if you just have a little 4x4 raised bed, just draw a quick sketch on a piece of paper. This doesn't have to be pretty, and start to think about what you're going to plant and when, and if you're going to have some crops are done in 90 days and other crops may go for a couple of months longer than that. So you can start to be strategic about what you're going to plant and when. Running your rows from north to south is sort of the ideal arrangement for the long rows to go, because that reduces the rows from shading one another. Because if you have very tall crops, the potential for one crop to shade the neighbor crop is pretty high, and we don't want that to happen. If you can't do that, don't want to do that, got creative with it, just make sure that you put the tall crops appropriately, and the best way to do that is make sure the tallest ones are at the north end. So, but just be mindful of that. You know, if you've got a trellis full of peas, you definitely don't want that on the south end of the garden because it will shade everything else. So think about that. Did you get the chat? Yeah, okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. The other thing that you can do in planning this is how do you arrange your crops? You can group by family. So if you have a larger garden, we recommend crop rotation. And a great example of this would be if you had a crop that, talk about those nematodes, you had something that had a real bad nematode infestation and was very sensitive to nematodes, then you could take it and plant a different crop in that area the following year. That's where that plan comes in handy, because if you didn't write it down on a piece of paper what you planted in that corner of the garden, I mean, really, who's going to remember that next August? Probably nobody. So these little sketches really help in the future. So you can group them by plant family, and that garden guide that I put the link to at the end, it tells you what family, these are the botanical families, that all the crops live in. So a good example would be the brassicas, like your broccoli and cauliflower and cabbages and things like that. So they're all in the same family. So you would group them by family, so then you can rotate those families in the future if you have a pest problem. You can do all these different arrangements any way you like, whatever works for you. You can also organize them by their planting and harvest dates, so that maybe as you move through the garden, one area is going to all be harvested at the same time, and that way you're not climbing over one crop to harvest another and disturbing everyone. Other folks get really creative with it and interplant. How many of you guys have heard of the Three Sisters? And if you all know how to do the little raise hand tool in Zoom, but if you've heard of the Three Sisters, raise your hand. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but I suspect some of you are like, I think I have. So the Three Sisters was something that the native people here in this country and probably elsewhere in the world used, where they would actually grow corn, beans, and squash together, all in the same spot. And so the cool thing about this is if you don't have a lot of space in your garden, you have 3 crops in one area, right? And the nice thing about it is that the corn would start to grow tall quickly, and then the beans, as they grew, would climb up the corn as a trellis, and then they would grow the squash below, and the squash has big wide leaves, and it would sort of keep the weeds down below. And they also work together in some other beneficial ways. But there's a clever way that the plants pluses and minuses work with one another, and also getting 3 things in one space. Another one that I love to do is radishes and carrots. You can put those in relative, in the same rows, because radishes from seed to harvest are usually about 30 days, and carrots are usually 3 times that. So you could plant radish and carrot seed all in the same spot, harvest your radishes before the carrots even get big. So you could be clever like that, or you can just go by the plant size so you don't shade things, or all the same kind of spacing. There's not too many rules
we have
about
a hand
it.
up.
Oh, we do. I think he had his
Yes.
hand up about Three Sisters, right? Probably. If you had a question.
I am just going to unmute myself because I can't figure out how to turn this thing off. Give me a second. Yes, I knew about the Three Sisters and I forgot to put the hand down. Thank you.
No worries. That is a thing. Sometimes getting these controls down is interesting, right? No matter how much we zoom, sometimes they're a little tweaky. Okay, wonderful. So this is a great question I got in the chat box too. Somebody's asking, they live in St. Pete near the water. This is from John. And he's asking if that's considered central planting zone. I'm glad you asked me about that. The Vegetable Garden Guide groups Florida into north, central, and south. However, for those of you who've lived in Pinellas long enough, you know that Pinellas County is a little bit different, a little bit special. We're on a peninsula, and we're surrounded by water. Most of Pinellas County is USDA hardiness zone 10, which would be more in line with South Florida. So I usually tell people most of Pinellas County, the southern part of Pinellas County, south of, say, Safety Harbor and or coastal, should probably lean towards the South Florida recommendations. Those of you who are like I am in Tarpon Springs, Palm Harbor, Safety Harbor is kind of on the border. If you're inland and away from the water, you would probably lean a little bit towards central because we're actually in zone 9. We have 2 different planting zones here. So you kind of have to tweak that a little bit, but if you're near the water in St. Pete, it's safe to say you want to go with South Florida calendar recommendations. That is a great question. I love when I do these things because people always ask the right questions that lead me from slide to slide. I love it. Oh yeah, and if you're next to the Philippi Park and Safety Harbor, yes, you're probably close enough to the water, and you might need the fence to keep those bears out, right? That was a thing recently. I was a little bit jealous. All right. Hopefully you don't actually have to worry about bears. I think feral cats is enough of a worry. So we've gone through planting our garden. You really need to study that Vegetable Garden Guide for timing. We'll touch on a couple of those things again though. Then you have to decide if you're planting from seed or if you're going to go ahead and plant transplants. And there's kind of some rules about this, but most of it really depends on your time and your budget, right? So you can go to the store and you can buy transplants that are already, a foot tall and already kind of jumpstart the garden. That's great if that's in your budget. They're a lot more money. But you can also just go to the store or online and buy seeds, which is much more economical. Some of our plants really prefer to be directly seeded in the garden. They don't do well with transplanting. And others, you can start your own transplants and then only put the ones that successfully grow in your garden. Because you guys know if you've ever planted seeds, they don't all germinate, they don't all grow. So if you put them directly, seed them in the garden, you might end up having to overplant and then thin them out. Or you can, you just end up with fewer successful plants in that row. But if you're planting from seed, a couple of rules of thumb to remember, and the big one is that don't plant the seed too deeply. So only plant however big the seed is, plant it about that deep in the soil. So as you can see in the top right here, those lettuce seeds as compared to a penny are quite small. So those you would just barely lay down in the soil and just barely cover with a little bit of soil, like dusting it on top. If a seed is larger, like a bean seed, you could make a trench in the soil about the size of that seed, make sure it's covered and with soil, but not too deeply. So if the bean is a 1/2 inch long, I wouldn't cover it with more than about a 1/2 inch of soil on top of that. That's your rule of thumb. Let's see what's in our chat box. Let's see. And I would say that Safety Harbor, if you're really close to the water, I would consider yourself South Florida. I'm not sure. There's actually a USD hardiness zone. She wanted to know which zone she was. And I know in Safety Harbor it gets a little dicey, but if you Google USDA hardiness zone map, you can actually put your zip code in and they will tell you. But I can tell you from looking that Safety Harbor, Dunedin, it's a border between zone 9B and 10A. And because of the change in climate that we're experiencing, you're likely to be 10A soon if you're not already. So if you're that near the water, you might just think about, I'm in South Florida. Okay, and there's a question about rooting from seeds that you get from the veggies you eat. We weren't going to talk a lot about collecting seeds, but you certainly can with very different success, and sometimes seeds to be treated a certain way or dried. Kelly, it might be better if you follow up with me with an email later, because we probably don't have time to get too deep into that. Time are we at? Yeah, we probably don't have time to get too deep into that, but I'm happy to answer questions about that, after we get done here. There's just so much to cover. Here's some of the things that transplant really well. Tomatoes, peppers, etc., that you see on here. So that means either you can buy the transplants and you're more likely to have success transplanting plants into the garden, or you can start your own. As you see in some of these pictures, you can use recycled containers. You can buy seed starting trays. That could take up to 6 weeks to start. So again, that's where a lot of people are starting seeds in July. And what I often tell people is, if you're starting like this, a protected area, like maybe a carport where they get bright sun, is great. And the protected area is good because when we have those heavy rains, those little bitty pots will often just get absolutely wiped out. The rain will wash all the seeds and soil out of them. So a covered patio with bright sun. An old trick that I heard that I guess the old Florida crackers used to use, and I've done with success, is underneath the sable palm, the big wide leaves, and it slows the rain as it falls from washing all your seeds away. I like that low tech approach. And when we're planting those, whether it's from your own transplants you grew or you purchased, you want to make sure you handle them gently when you remove them from their containers. We don't want to disturb the roots too much, especially the little bitty fine root hairs that are on there that you really can't see, but are very important in water uptake. You're going to make your hole a little bit bigger than that root ball that came out of the transplant container, and make sure that you plant it at the same depth. So don't bury it too deeply. There's a note on here that tomatoes and peppers can be planted more deeply. They don't mind, but most crops you want to plant the same height. Otherwise, you'll smother their roots. And then as you're gently pressing this into the soil and pressing the soil around it, make sure that you water. This is a great, like, watering can is a nice gentle application of water for this. Just water those seeds in as you go. Make sure there's no air pockets around that root system, because then they'll dry out. And then to water your garden, you're going to want to water in the morning, and morning is just best. Like, just remember, always water in the morning. This is for everything in your whole yard. Water in the morning every day for about a week, right? And you're going to have to watch your plants, because you can start to back this off once all the seeds have sprouted, because seeds need regular moisture to germinate. So the general rule is every day for a week. Second week, if everything is sprouted, you can start to back off to every other day. As they get bigger, every third day. And then eventually you should be tapering off to about once a week. Now, that's a guideline. It's not raining right now. It's very dry and hot. It's probably going to have to be more. And there's no real specific rule about that in the vegetable garden. But you don't want to overdo it. You want to make sure that when you're done that the soil remains moist, but not wet and mucky. So basically, if you pick up a handful of that soil, squeeze it, water shouldn't dribble out of it. It should just kind of stick together and feel like an already wrung out sponge. That's what you're shooting for, is a damp sponge that all the water's already wrung out of. Oh, and Amanda, thank you for mentioning Safety Harbor Library has a seed bank you can get free seeds from, as does the Palm Harbor Library. There may be others, but I know those two have them. Thank you. Free seeds are wonderful. Any way you can save money. Fertilizing your plants is going to be really important. So you're going to want to apply a fertilizer to your whole garden before planting. And we like a balanced fertilizer, like you see here, like a 666 or 15, 15, 15, something where the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium, those three numbers on the fertilizer bag, are pretty even. Now, a lot of them will say things like 4, 6, 8. They won't be exactly even. But the good thing is because of our fertilizer ordinance here in Pinellas, they can only sell fertilizers most of the year, especially in the summertime right now, stuff that's labeled for use in the vegetable garden. And so that's ideal. And I always say that anyways, because you really want to apply a fertilizer made for the vegetable garden just in case. Some other fertilizers are weed and feeds, and they contain herbicides. And if you don't read the bag carefully, and you know those bags have teeny tiny letters, you could end up putting, something that prevents seeds from germinating in your garden. So best always to stick with what it's labeled for. So pick a fertilizer label for the vegetable garden. Now, that being said, they can only sell certain things during the summer because of our fertilizer ordinance. Vegetable gardens are exempt from the fertilizer ordinance. So we are allowed to fertilize with nitrogen in the vegetable garden, and as long as we're using that product labeled as such. So you don't have to worry about running afoul of the rules, but certainly not anywhere else in the landscape. As you go, so you fertilize when you first plant, and then as you go, when the plants get to be about 6 inches tall, you're gonna do something called side dressing. And that's basically where you take the fertilizer and it'll tell you how much to apply per square foot. So always read those directions really carefully and figure out how much you need to apply. And then you're gonna take that and you're gonna put a row of it. So along your rows, about 3 inches away from your plant stems, you put a row of fertilizer down one side. 3 weeks later, you do the same on the other side. And we alternate sides so that we don't get any concentration of too many nutrients or too many salts from the fertilizer in any one spot. We gotta keep it moving around. You can also, in some containers, or if you have weird shapes, you can also do a circular band. And then of course, you may have to repeat this multiple times if you have a crop that's gonna take, like, say 4 months to mature. So you're gonna wanna look at doing that every 3 weeks throughout the growing season. And then I know a bunch of you are wondering about organic fertilizers versus conventional fertilizers. And the difference is mainly that the organic ones are made from plants and animals, and they release their nutrients more slowly. So the great thing is you're less likely to burn your plants. You're definitely less likely to be putting anything in there that doesn't belong there. You also reduce the risk of water pollution, because we definitely like that and want to protect our water quality. And it's nice because even though organic fertilizers do typically cost more money, they release those nutrients more slowly. And so you probably won't even have to apply them as frequently. And it'll say on the bag, it'll give my rule on the last page of about every 3 weeks. That may vary. And I always say the label, that's what you follow. So if your label says every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, you do what the label says, unless you're making your own. And compost you can add anytime. So if you're making your own home compost or you buy it, you can add that as a top dressing over the garden at any time, but you just want to be careful to add a thin layer of it so that you're not smothering the plants. You can also add it, like let's say you pull out a crop of radishes and you want to then go plant something else. Before you plant that new something else is the perfect time to add that compost right then and there. It won't be bothering anybody's roots. And that last crop used up those nutrients. We can be pretty sure of that. So then another thing, because there's just never enough time. Another thing as we come to the end of this is, what are we planning to grow as we come into fall? Because I'm telling y'all, you're planning and getting ready for fall. And we basically look at our vegetables, and in the guide, they tell you which are cool season crops and which are warm season crops. And it's really easy to understand because the cool season crops like the cool weather and the warm season crops like the warm weather. And we're very unique here in Florida that we go into our garden season in the fall and it's still pretty hot, right? August and September are hot here. So we're still doing warm season crops to start off the fall garden. As we move later into the season, we get closer to winter, we move to our cool season crops that like that cooler weather. The only thing we have to think about over the winter is protecting them if we do get a frost or a freeze. Those are not common here anymore, but we do get them. And so you might have to think about throwing some frost cloth over the garden or covering it if we are going to experience that. But these are some common popular vegetables we can start planting in August and September. And a little bit later in the season, as you look ahead, these are some of the things we can plant in October, November, and these are some great examples of our cool season crops. And I see a question in the chat box. Oh, okay. So Linda says she recently used organic fertilizer on the ornamentals and her dog kept trying to eat the fertilizer. Yes, so dogs will eat all kinds of stuff, and a lot of organic fertilizers do contain, fish emulsions or chicken byproducts and feathers and things that might be attractive to dogs. And having a dog, I just know that they get into all kinds of stuff. And for me, it works better to separate the dog from the garden space. Dogs are a little bit easier in that way than cats, as we mentioned. So do keep that in mind, that if you're going to have a vegetable garden, if you can't fence it off, then you're going to probably want to think about supervising the dog while you're out there, and consider the practicality of that for your lifestyle. Is that a good way to say that, right? Dog behavior. For those of you who want to have a resource on hand and you don't want to, the garden guide that I give you a link to is like the quick and dirty version. It's like the cliff notes of this book that you see here. But this is a great book called Vegetable Gardening in Florida. It's by James Stevens. You can buy it on Amazon. University of Florida IFAS has a bookstore. You can buy it there. Both of them sometimes have a sale price on it, but it's usually about 17 bucks. So something that you might want to add to your library if you'd like to. I will also add that most of the local libraries here do have at least a copy of this. I've been to them and taught classes, and they said, oh yeah, we have that here. So you can also check this out at the library, make all the copies you want, save yourself a few more bucks to put towards seeds and soil amendments, right? So you don't have to buy it to make use of it. And then the other thing, before we wrap up with a few more questions, because we don't have too much more time here, is I really wanted to make sure that you all know the resource that you have in us here at Extension. I know the county has thousands of employees, and we do all kinds of jobs everywhere, and we don't always get to know who works in other departments or what they do. So we're here all the time to help you with your plant questions, animal questions. I mean, we even have Sea Grant, so talk about coastal issues. But specific to garden questions, we have lots of ways you can contact us. So you can email us. You can email us at hort@pinellascounty.org. You can even call us on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. We take a little break at lunchtime there and ask us questions over the phone. There's the phone number. You can even drop by our help desk, as Jane pointed out, which is located in the lobby of the Florida Botanical Gardens in Largo. And we're there Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. We're closed for lunch there as well. And of course, we're closed on the same holidays that y'all get off. So you won't have any trouble remembering that. So feel free to come by and talk to us. You can bring us plants, you can bring us insects to identify. You can send us pictures. We do not have the book at the office for sale. But the Florida Botanical Gardens has a gift shop, which is right across the hall from us in our office. I have seen it for sale there before, but I don't know if they always keep it in stock. So you're probably safer buying it online to be sure. I'm also going to put my email in the chat box here, because in addition to that hort@pinellascounty.org, you can always just email me, especially after class, because I'm not the only one who looks at that Hort box. And if you send them a question about class, they'll go, what class was that? But if you send it right to me, I'll know which class it was. So that I just put my direct email into the chat box. But I just want you to know that we're here for that, all of that stuff. You can send us pictures, come by and talk to us. And we just want to make sure that you know that, because we're all one big team. Oh, okay, let me see if there's a question in the chat box. So I was going to say, this is the part of the class where we can basically just ask some more questions that you might have missed earlier. Somebody's asking what they can use to kill the little white gnat bugs. I'm assuming, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, if this is out in the vegetable garden, you're talking about the little white flying bugs that kind of fly around the plants when you disturb them. Those are called white flies. Isn't that appropriate, right? Sometimes the names actually fit really, really well. So white flies can be managed in a couple ways. So their larvae are what does most of the damage to the plant, but you can actually get these things from garden centers, or you can make your own, called yellow sticky cards. This is really high-tech stuff. It is a cardboard card painted or colored primary yellow, and it has a sticky coating on it. The adult white flies are attracted to the color yellow, and then they stick to the card and die. And then they quit laying eggs and they quit having larvae on your plants, and you reduce the population over time. So that's a non-chemical way to reduce the white flies. If you have an infestation on the plants, you can use, I shuddered to like make specific recommendations because I really like to know exactly what bug you have, but they do sell soaps and oils that are much more gentle on the plants and for you. And like someone just mentioned, neem oil for the white flies that are safe to use in the vegetable garden. Always want to read the label, even if it's labeled organic, because even organic things have specific rules or maybe times of the year or temperatures where it's safe to apply them. And even organic chemicals may have a time to harvest where, let's say you treat, but you have to wait a week before you can harvest and eat the plant. And so just be mindful of that. The neem oil will kill most insects in the garden because, and as well, a lot of the oils they sell for vegetable gardens are based on some sesame oils, and there's some other vegetable oils they use. And they basically smother the insect. Insects breathe through little spiracles on their exoskeleton. And so oil covers them and they can't breathe and they die. So a lot of oils work, but the trouble is some oils are very heavy and can harm the plant. So you want to have something made for your plants. There's some chat box stuff going on. Will neem oil kill the black bugs that eat my green beans? Without knowing exactly what the black bugs were, if it was like a true bug that looks kind of like a hard-shelled stink bug type of a bug, if it gets on them, it will. For those, it's often better just to knock them off in a bucket of soapy water and drown them. You know, if the green beans were being eaten by a caterpillar, and this is a good rule in general in the vegetable garden, if your crops are being chewed up by caterpillars, then you're going to want to use something called BT. And I will put this in the chat box. And I'm only writing BT. It's capital letter B, lowercase t. It's short for Bacillus thuringiensis. And I don't want to spell that wrong, so I'm not going to type that in the chat box. But it's an organic product that kills caterpillars and it's completely safe for everything else. So that's a nice product to use. The caution there would be not to put your BT anywhere near a butterfly garden because you will decimate the butterfly garden, and I don't want that. Let's see what else we have here. Someone mentioned diatomaceous earth. Have you guys heard about this? Diatomaceous earth they're basically the fossils of diatoms, which are these little microscopic critters from the bottom of the sea. And they're great to control any number of insects. They have these microscopic little glass-like, they basically cut up the outside of the insect and then they dry out and die. Diatomaceous earth is a nice, safe product to use. Make sure you get the kind that is either food grade or made for the garden. And you can sprinkle that over the soil and it will kill any insect really that walks through it. Just make sure you don't use the stuff that's for pool filters because that sometimes has other stuff in it. Crushed eggshells, let's see here. You can put crushed eggshells into your compost, yep. And somebody asked about snails and slugs. Some of the best things to do for snails and slugs is they do make some baits you can use. So you can buy, and you can also get a little shallow dish and fill it with like a sweet fruit juice, and some recipes even call for beer, a little banana slice, and some water. So it's basically a real shallow dish, kind of make it at soil level so that when they come to the garden, they're attracted to that sweet, fruity smell, and then they fall in and drown. So that's a great way to deal with snails and slugs. That's chemical free. Let's see what we have here. Oh, okay. So there's a question in here about a related edible crop, right, from Linda about her key lime tree. And her neighbor's grapefruit tree got diseased. And it probably, she mentioned she thought it had citrus greening. It probably did, unfortunately. Most of our citrus has been victim to citrus greening disease. What she asked is it okay to plant a key lime tree again? And is there a treatment for citrus greening? There is not a treatment for citrus greening, unfortunately. There are some crops that are more resistant. But if you want to send me an email, we can talk more about that later. I see a lot of people saying they have to go. I know it's the end of lunch break. Jane, do you want to say anything before? I can stick around, but if you want to pop in and say anything before everyone hops off.
No, I just, lots of great engagement in the chat. Love it. You have provided so much great information.
Too much, probably.
And I'm sure you're going to be getting a lot of emails. So
I hope so.
What you wish for, right?
Yes, yes.
And if I get any in the wellness box, if folks just, happen to miss your email, then I will forward it to everybody. I will, I need to jump off the meeting as well, but I will not end the meeting.
Okay.
So for all of you that do want to stick around, and Theresa, it's your call as to, when you want to end it.
Yeah, I can stick around for a few minutes.